sit down.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of My Own Little World. Today's going to be a little bit of break. Hold on, let me pause the music. Today's going to be a little break from our PostgreSQL or more technical things. And today we're going to be talking about developer relations stuff. And so just to give you some background, I've been doing developer relations since about 2005. And then I've also been doing development since 1998. We started off with in college I took a couple programming classes, but then in my PhD I did a bunch of programming, and then ever since then I've been doing lots of programming. So I have a lot of experience with developer sites. I have a lot of opinions, in case you've never noticed that about me before. And then I have been doing a lot of developer relations and spent a lot of time thinking about how to help developers be successful at what they do. So, I'm started a new project recently, and we'll get to that in a second. And I came across a developer site, and I was like, there's this, and they should do this, and maybe this is, but this is nice. And then I was like, oh, well, maybe I can use this as the beginning of a series of different developer sites that can give people feedback on how to make their developer sites better and what makes a good developer site. And as again, that was me checking to make sure there's no comments yet. As always, please leave comments. First things first, though, I'm drinking some tea today from my excellent mug. This mug was actually a gift for the Queen, my Queen, not the British Queen or the Swedish Queen or any other queens that might exist out there, but my Queen, Becklina, Angelina Rennell. And she did not like it, but so I took it over. It was made by Josh Berkus, probably best known originally for his PostgreSQL stuff, but now he does a lot of Kubernetes stuff. So I will put a link up if you want to see his excellent pottery and want to purchase them for yourselves. You would think that the ears actually interfere with your ability to drink, but that is not true. Watch. And no ears poking in your face. So it's a great mug. Nothing else personal, really. I'm still playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare a lot. Tons going on in the world. Look at my Twitter stream for me to see what I have to say about it or what I'm trying to do about it. Not going to talk about it here today because it would take hours and days, and I just can't right now. I just can't. It's the world, the U.S. in particular, is particularly heartbreaking right now. Okay, so back to the developer relation stuff. So what I want to start with is to introduce you to one of the main things that drives my ideas about developer relations. Oh, and by the way, let's just get this caveat out of the way. All developer sites suck. All of them do. Some suck less than others, right? And that's just basically what we're going to do. So I'm going to try to say what sites got right and what they got wrong, and try to help for improvement. But just know that I don't think there's any perfect developer site out there. I do think some do a better job than others, but they all have problems. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk to some of the one of the basic ideas of developer relations that drives my ideas about developer sites. So let's go to Studio and change it to this. And so who I'm going to introduce you to is Kathy Sierra. If you haven't heard of Kathy Sierra and you do any developer relations work, you should. You should read all her work. If you do any developer work, you should read her stuff because she does great stuff on user interaction and how you should think about your users, which almost all software has users. So one of her famous sayings is upgrade your user, not your product. Make people better at something they want to get better at. Right? We spend a lot of times as engineers building new and cool features, and that's not necessarily always what the user really needs. They just want to get better at the things that they want to get done. And so she came up with this idea, and I gave a whole talk on it, which I'll link in the show notes, called the kick-ass curve. And this is the kick-ass curve. So there's time, time evolving, and then there's ability, right? So first time somebody uses something to years and decades of use, and on the ability axis, we have you're struggling with frustration, and at the top, you're in a productive flow state, right? You can get into a flow state really easy with stuff. And then if you would imagine, there's some theoretical suck threshold. It's actually an actual suck. I mean, we can't measure the actual suck threshold. And anything below this, you feel like you suck. I suck at this. This is the worst. I hate the software. I hate myself. Everything sucks. And then there's this kick-ass threshold where when you get above that threshold, you're like, I kick ass. The software kicks ass. The world is awesome. Look at how I can just sit down, start banging stuff out, and make great things right away. Right? And so there's these two lines on the ability. And so this is kind of the typical, it's a logistic curve for what she drew for a kick-ass curve, right? So when people first start out, they spend a lot of time down in the suck zone, and then they get above the suck zone, and then they're like, oh, okay, this isn't quite so bad anymore, right? And then they get above that, and then eventually over time, they'll get up into this kick-ass threshold. So our job in developer relations, and your job if you're building stuff for people, is that as a tool for people to use, like software or an API or any of that kind of stuff, is to try to get people out of this zone as quickly as possible and up to this zone as quickly as possible, right? And one of the primary tools we have for that, oh, well, one other thing, hold on. This is the typical one, but that doesn't mean that you can't have like a really great one, an ideal one, right? That gets you all the way, that the person linear effort gives you linear increase and it's a nice and steep slope. And there's also nothing to stop you from having a really bad one, which makes your users hate you and get bad reviews and stuff like that, right? Where basically, no matter how much time I spend in, my increase in feeling of competence and ability to get done what I want to get done is really slow and terrible, right? And if you think about developers, especially for myself and when I talk to most developers, they're very task-oriented and they like to do stuff. And then you make it, the easier you make it for them to do the thing they want to do, the more they like you and the faster they get up this curve. And so you can do some of this with really good API design or really good interface design. But if it's a developer product, developers are going to write and customize and write their own code. And so you really need to help to teach them how to do that. All right, that's the background on the kick-ass curve, and that's all we're going to talk about it for today. What I've been working on lately is I've been doing some volunteer work. No, not now, thanks. I've been doing some volunteer work with islandconservation.org. I'm trying to do some Postgres work for them. And they are a group that focuses specifically on island conservation. And one of the problems on lots of islands is not conserving the island, but the animals and plants that live on the island. Because islands generally don't go anywhere except for earthquakes, and there's not much you can do about those. But one of the things that you can do for island conservation is you can get removed rats. Humans tend to bring rats into islands, and rats are really bad, not native to most islands, and they're really bad for local wildlife and for plant life too. And so they focus a lot on eradicating rats from islands and other animals too, snakes and cats and things like that. But today we're going to just talk about rats, right? And it's a pretty big issue. So one of the problems sometimes with getting rid of rats is you can't always just use straight up poison, because you might, like, for example, the Catalina Islands off of the coast of California also have fox nearby, right? Like on that same island, and they're native fox, right? I forget what the Catalina Island kit fox or something like that. And so if you put out poison traps for the rats, it's highly likely that the fox will either eat poisoned rats and accumulate that poison and die themselves, which is why you should not also use rat poison in your yard or anywhere around your house, because especially if you live in a suburban or rural setting. But the other problem is even the fox may eat the bait themselves, right? Whatever makes it taste good to the rats may make it taste good. And so you end up killing a species of concern trying to get rid of the rats. So there's a product called Contrapest, and they contacted Island Conservation, and the two groups together are running a trial to see how effective Contrapest, is a birth control agent for rats. So the idea is you prevent the females from being able to get pregnant, and therefore the population eventually over time will decline. Like, you can't get rid of them right away, but you can get rid of them by not allowing them to reproduce. So Island Conservation is working on a trial, and I'm trying to help with some of their field work. And so they found that for their needs, the ArcGIS collector app made a really nice field app for going out and collecting all the data directly out of the field, especially since it's a spatial trial, right? So that means because they're using the collector, the data is getting pushed directly into ArcGIS Online. This is all a long way of getting to why I got to this API, right? And why I've been using it lately. So I was going to work with grabbing this data, putting it into a nicely relational database and putting it into Postgres, and allowing them to do analysis with normal SQL, because this isn't a full relational structure, right? They built the tables and the layers in a way that makes it easy to build the forms, not necessarily in the way that it should be to be doing the analysis. So I had to write some Python scripts because Python's the language I know. There's plenty of other languages I could have used, but I chose Python because I wanted to be able to download the data from the API and then go ahead and munge it and then put it into a Postgres table. So that's what we're doing, right? And so the thing that we want to do is I want to show you some. So now we're going to start talking about the ArcGIS Online stuff. So this interface is pretty nice, right? This isn't actually the developer site. This is just the catalog interface to the data set. And if I click on trap check, right, it shows the metadata for that trap, which is nice. It's got these objects in here. Cool. Like here's all the fields for it, right? It says what's the object ID field. It does all this really great stuff, has that. And I'm like, okay, great. How do I get to it? Oh, look, there's an API reference. So I click on the API reference, and that brings me to the ArcGIS REST API site. So now we can start talking about the website. Everybody good? Any questions yet so far? Go ahead and drop them in the chat if you're there. Let's go ahead and get going then. So we'll start with what they've got good right away. They've got some like service references up on the top. They link back to ArcGIS for developers, which is their global site. They tell me who I am. That's all nice. They've got a search bar right up on the top right away. I don't like these large graphics on the top space, right? We have one fold, and they have now taken up probably at least a quarter of their space with just a large bunch of graphics, forcing me to scroll down and not revealing everything. So this is very common on a lot of developer sites where they put these huge headers up here with big words and maybe a getting started button or something, but then they take up a bunch of space with graphics, which is not necessary to me, and I don't actually really care about it. I'm trying to get a job done. And in this case, my job is to try to figure out how to pull down these tables using Python, because that's the script I want to use. So I do the natural developer thing. I go, okay, let's see if they have something for Python. All right, we're still going. So here's a bunch more on getting started, right? It's still taking up a bunch of space, and it actually took me 2 scrolls of my wheel on my mouse to find that there's an ArcGIS API for Python. Now, a little background knowledge. I used to work at ESRI. I forget how many years ago, probably like 2005 to 2006. So 15 years ago. So I'm a little biased in my assessment of them. And I'm trying very actively to counteract that and just be as neutral as possible. Okay. I would say that if I were redesigning this site, I would move the SDKs up to the top to interact with. These are the SDKs to interact with the REST API. Most developers come from a language. They didn't have a language they want. And if there's an SDK to make my interactions with the REST endpoint easier, I will probably want it, and I'll want to see it right away. So if you can, I would say on your developer site, move these up higher rather than putting it basically 2 folds, 1, 2, almost 3 folds down before I can find them. And they don't need to be this big at the top. You could have had a drop down right up here that said SDKs, and it would have given a link to all the SDKs, right? So I kind of knew they probably had different SDKs talking to some of the people. And so I was like, I knew to scroll down. If I hadn't, I probably would have just clicked on getting started, right? And I think they're getting started. You find out there that they do have SDKs. So I would say, okay, look, I want to use Python, right? And download data. That's great. So they do one of the things I don't like is they're actually using the Esri Jupyter notebooks, right? So this is a bit of this one I can claim is very much my own bias. I am not a fan of notebooks. I think they teach. Look at Joel Gru's talk at what was it, NotebookCon or something like that, about why he hates notebooks. He gave it at like the Jupyter Notebook conference. And I agree with most of his points that I actually think it teaches you to be a bad Python programmer. I mean, it's somewhat convenient to look at and stuff, but it makes you a bad Python programmer. But that's okay. I mean, that's kind of a religious thing. It doesn't matter. They do a nice job of not actually making me download the notebooks. I can just look at the files here, right? And so here's where I start running into a problem though. Store the ID of the public data item. Wait, so I don't understand where I'm putting in where did I get this public data item we want to download, right? So we can go click on that. It brings us to, oh, there's this data set. Where did you get that ID from? Right? You didn't tell me how to get that ID. And I don't see anywhere on this page that it gives me this ID. Right? Let's see if this, okay. So I guess we have to go to the REST endpoint of the data. What I actually did, so this is not what I actually did, right? I didn't click the getting started up there on top. What I did was, I, as a Python developer, knew I wanted the Python SDK, so I said this. I skipped the getting started button right away, which was my fault, okay? But I said, oh, a guide, let's learn how to download your data, right? And so, okay, API overview, I start looking at that, right? Architecture of the API, blah, blah, blah. So one of the things I do when I review this is I pretend I'm the busy developer who doesn't really want to read everything, right? And I think that when you're designing a developer site, that's a good idea not to assume that the developer is not going to want to read all of this. This is way too much for me to do. If I even click getting started here, which I think I actually did, right? The get started here. I did the install and setup. That's cool. I think they actually did a nice job of showing you how to do the installation. That's really good in the getting started for lots of different ways. I actually followed the get conda. I don't have ArcGIS on my desktop, so I know that they assume that people do, but I think I don't like that part, but whatever. I don't need any of the GIS, those deep learning dependencies. Anyway, so then so I was like, oh, cool, using the API. So I would like to point out, this is a good job. They did a really good job of 5 minutes to win, right? And this is an idea that you'll see in lots of places, which you're getting started should within 5 minutes get the developer, and 5 minutes can be a leeway. It depends on how complicated or different your thing is to normal stuff. Like I give them more than 5 minutes because we're dealing with spatial data and it's particular to the API, and there's some stuff you have to learn, right? But the idea is, by the end of a short getting started, I, as a developer, should feel a win. I've done something and I've connected. So what they do here is they did a good job. They just say, do this, right? Do GIS, my GIS map, and you get a map. It's a map of the world, but that doesn't matter. I actually get a map of the world. The reason this works in the Jupyter Notebook is because they have the ability to, the Esri Jupyter Notebook is they have the ability to draw a map. I could have actually just done mygis.map and M and started using it, right? And interrogated it and stuff. Here they talk about, this is stuff I don't care about, but it was good. So I was like, cool, all right. Well, that's good. I know how to connect now, and I know that it's working. So that's a really good step. I really like that they did that. Now I did that. That's all the getting started. Oh, that's not enough for me. All right. I actually want to do feature data and analysis, I guess, is what I want to do. So I start clicking around, guessing at what I want to do. And so this is where I think they run into what their biggest problem is. I am coming looking for a specific data set, right? And almost all the examples, so I go, okay, working with features and layers, I see that stuff there. All their examples are talking about doing either anonymous connections, right? And they just start looking through anonymous data sets that are available to everybody, right? Their first thing they do is they do searching for GIS feature layers, right? Accessing feature layers. And I can guess that I want a feature layer because if I go back to here, I've got layers and tables. So I figure I probably want a feature layer. And that's what I know also from working at Esri. But I don't want to search. I want to actually get to my data set. I have a data set. I want to get to it. How do I get to it? And there's actually very little documentation anywhere on the site about how to actually get, other than that one we saw, that one place in the getting started, about how to get to my data. And so that was really frustrating for me. Like I spent a day doing searches trying to figure out how to get to my data. So I started playing around with accessing a feature layer from a feature URL. Maybe I figured out how to authenticate, right? I forget where there was the authentication. I figured that out somewhere, not connecting. I forget where I learned that. Maybe it was in the feature model. I don't know. It wasn't there. Somewhere I figured out how to authenticate. And what the authentication ends up looking like is this, right? You actually put in the site, but there's a difference between enterprise users and non-enterprise users, and it wasn't made clear to figure out, and your URL changes depending on that, right? And I wasn't clear to me how I should do that. So what I would critique the site a bunch on is how to get to my data and how to authenticate quickly and how to get to my data. It's nice that I did the anonymous connection and knew that my API was working. I could connect and get stuff. But the next task that most developers are going to want to do is I want my data, right? I put my data in, I want my data, or I want to put data into my space that I made for myself. And they didn't cover that right away in a getting started, right? So it turns out you both need your username and password, which is equal to the username and password I log into the site. I've changed these, so I'm not worried that if you see them. And then the other thing is that unique identifier that we needed to get to our actual layer collection, right? The gis.content. So we get the GIS, the handle to the ArcGIS Online, and then we say, hey, for my content, get this library of data, which is that contrapress trial thing that we're looking at, right? And then that gives you back a layer collection, which is everything in it. But I didn't know how to get those things. And that was extremely frustrating and made me, as a developer, really angry because this should have been very simple and easy to find out. And there was no good documentation on it, right? So that's one thing I would say is if in your developer site, people are allowed to have their own data, cover how authentication works quickly and right away so that people know how to authenticate properly. And then quickly and easily show them how to get to find out where their data is named, right? So it's not really quick and easy to figure out how my data was named. And then actually show them how to get a handle to their own data, right? They want to get a handle to their data so they can navigate it. The next thing that came up for me is, well, I want to start querying my data. I figured out how to navigate the layers. The next thing that came up for me is I wanted to start querying the data. And that actually gets to this, right? So we have the Python API. We're going to start looking through it. It has the layer. So in the top layer, they have layer, which is a layer in the feature layers that we had. But there's no table, and I actually wanted to get to the tables. Remember back here, there's some tables. This one I just downloaded these as CSVs and imported them. These are the ones that were harder to deal with because I actually need to get to the tables. There's a layer. I don't know how to get to the table. And if you look in the documentation, because ArcGIS is very map focused, they don't put as much. It turns out you have to go down to the features model, and then there's a table there, right? So the feature layer is composed of both features and tables. And I know, so don't get me wrong, I know that if I go back, right? Oh no, hold on. If I go back here, if I had taken my time and gone through the features model, and then like, here's features, and there's a feature layer, which has a table and a feature collection, and you can query all of those, right? But I don't think a lot of developers are going to sit down and read necessarily through like this. There should have been a set of small tutorials that were talk about, here's more flow-based about how you get to something. You want to query your tables. Okay, well, you need to understand features. And so here, let us talk you quickly through that. Go look, and then link to this kind of documentation, right? Like if you want to learn more, go here. But I want to do the task first and get the win before I have to read through a whole bunch of stuff and understand diagrams. All right. So that take home for you as a developer site is walk people through, have some part of your site. You need reference documentation. You can't get rid of that. But have some part of your site which walks people through tasks that they're interested in and link back to the reference or the more deeper explanations so that when people want to go figure out what they just did, they can go read that then. But expecting them to go through this, especially on screens where people have a much harder time reading, putting big chunks of text like this is really hard. All right. So we figured out that we wanted to get tables off of feature layers. That's great. We want to do a query because we want to be able to check that we're only getting new records. Okay, so we want to do a query. So when we go to the table, sorry, it's in the features right? And so we can say feature, right? We don't actually want feature, we want table. And one of the things you see here in query, we keep looking through, you got this source, the table, and you can, there's append, there's calculate. This is for Python people. I don't understand why you people don't have a nice little, in Python documentation, you don't have, like in Java doc, we get this nice little thing where all the methods are linked at the top so I can scroll through just the method signatures without having to scroll through all the documentation. Like, let me just show you Java doc. All right, so let's look at someone's, I should actually do Java doc. Let's do it for Lucene. That's a project I like. All right, so here's the documentation. And if I look at the, where is it? Is that the, no, that's not the Java doc. That's the walking you through reference docs. Yeah, here. So here's the Java doc. So like if I go to an object, like the Lucene object, the Lucene, no, that's not going to be good. Here, text analysis, right? And I'm going to look at an analyzer. Like there's a little bit of text and then there's all the methods listed at the top. And if I want to go to a method, I click on that method and I go to it. But I can look at all the methods and signatures without having to scroll through. This bugs me about Python. This is the Python way. So I will also compliment Esri for doing a really good job on their Python doc. It follows the Python pattern for doc. It just bugs me as a Java developer that I have to scroll through. Okay, back to where we're headed. There's a query method. Or there's a get or something like that. I can't remember right now. Hold on. Delete features, edit features. What is it? Export attachments, generate renderer, get HTML. Where is it? Query. So they have a where clause is equal to. It says optional string. And then it says the selection SQL statement. Right? So this is a problem. And this is a problem for a lot of developer sites. You have some sort of, you say it's like SQL. It's not actually SQL. Right? It's very SQL-like, but it's not exactly SQL. And you don't have a reference on what your query language looks like, and you don't link to it right here. Right? So I was like, great, the selection SQL statement. Well, how do I know how to write a timestamp? Should I just write where, and this certain field is equal to, and how do I denote fields? Right? Do I just do it like SQL? And it turns out it's not really SQL. So I do a lot of digging around for a while to try to get at what this SQL statements look like. And we go to, well, and I actually want to do a time query too, right? So we go to here. I look around a lot. I actually go back to the REST API because I know there's a REST API underneath of it, right? And I get to this. I start looking through the REST API documentation and I get here. And this is a blog post, right? And I'm like, this is a blog post. That's great. And that's how I actually figured out what the standardized queries are supposed to know, what they look like, right? It's not actually SQL. It's the date field, which is normal. You don't put where, you don't put any of that stuff. You do the where equals, not the normal SQL statement. And then you actually have to put the word timestamp in front. Well, so that's great. I finally figured that out after finding this blog post, right? I went through a lot of places and it's in the blog post, but it's still not exactly telling you what you want. And I don't actually like blog posts acting as documentation. This should have been docked in the doc site. There should be documentation about what the queries look like and how you deal with time. And so that brings us to the next point, which is time is tricky, but a lot of spatial data has time attributes to it. And you have to be really clear about how you deal with time. So I got this working and I'm yanking time out of my table. And when I'm yanking time out of my table, it comes back in Pacific time, which also happens to be the time the data was collected. So I'm like, cool, I'm getting the data back in Pacific time, not doing anything on my own, just using the Python API, not setting anything. I then push that into Postgres in Pacific time. And then I do the query again. I query back to say, don't give me any data older than the most recent entry. And I get back 15 entries. And I'm like, what is going on? And a lot of digging and talking on Slack and a whole bunch of other stuff. And we figure out that because it's not, there's no discussion of it here, right? There's no discussion of it here. There's no discussion of it on this one here either, right? It doesn't talk about any of that. It says if the date field is specified in the out field, the date time will always be returned in formatted UTC, right? It's not in the out fields list. I'm just querying based on it, so I don't know what it's coming back as. If I look back at the layer itself, right, and I look back at the fields, it's where is it? It's under check date or creation date. It's just Esri field type date. So there's no time zone information there either. So I just assume it's storing it in whatever time the date is putting in. Turns out after a lot of searching and digging around over days, find out that it's being stored in UTC. If you look at the web page, if I look at the web map for that table, it shows the entries in my local time. So the web interface is smart enough to say, well, and in this case, I actually think it's not smart to show it in the local time of the browser. Not in the time the data was collected, but in the time of the browser, right? And so it translated it again to Pacific time because I happen to be in the Pacific time. So I start asking more questions, and it turns out there are a few docs that discuss it, but they're not actually like, they're under managing data in ArcGIS Online, right? Then it says, oh, the fields are stored in UTC time, how they're displayed. It goes through all this stuff. It's nowhere in any of that Python SDK stuff or linked to. Right? Like, again, here under this query, I think there should be a bunch of links about here's how we handle time, here's how we do a bunch of stuff so that people can figure out their SQL query. Okay. The other thing that turns out, though, is the Python SDK, even though it's getting stored in UTC, the Python SDK is giving me back the dates. I still don't know how in my time. And I don't know if that's the time that the Python SDK grabbed from my machine. There's no documentation on it anywhere. And I've gotten someone from the services team at ESRI to say they're going to look into it, and they haven't gotten back to me. But I don't blame them because it was in a Slack discussion, right? So what ends up happening is, I think, by feeling around the elephant, I have to convert the time that's stored, because that's not the right time. I have to convert it to UTC time, and then send that back out in the query when I query again on the way in. So when I grab it, say, hey, this is the time in UTC. Convert that time that was in Pacific into UTC, store UTC in the database as UTC time, and then use that query back out again. So that was days worth of work and not knowing what was going on and doing all this feeling around like the elephant and trying to figure out what I'm touching. That could have been avoided by good documentation here. And that's the kind of stuff that it's not this bad, but that's the kind of stuff that makes me very angry at an API when the query language is not clear to me, right? And when I do some critiquing of the PostgreSQL site, that'll be my next one, I'll point that out with the full text search, where it prevents me from basically using a lot of the full text functionality because of this query language problem. And times are hard, meaning dealing with times is hard, and you need to spend time in your documentation describing and being very clear about how you handle time. Times and encodings are the two worst things for programmers. So that's all of the site I really kind of played with. It turns out, though, if I look under like time zone or anything like that in the search, you're like, oh, they had a search feature, Steve. Why don't you use the search feature? So if I go back to that, right, and it's not under the API for Python. It's actually, it's up here, right? And I could put in something like time zone, right? Because I'm trying to figure out how to deal with time zones in their data. It's making your data accessible to the GIS. It doesn't creating hurricane tracks. There's nothing in here that talks about actually dealing with time zones, right? It's more, this one's not about that, right? So there's nothing under the Python SDK. And then so when I started searching the overall SDK, that I found some of that other stuff, and then it was just feeling around. So it was really frustrating. I would also, their API is actually quite nice. The Python SDK's API is actually quite nice. It's just that a lot of their guides where was it that I wanted to do? I wanted to do, there's the getting started, right? And then there's all the topics. A lot of the topics don't deal with using your own data. Like, they deal with, this one does. But if I did one like querying, which is mostly what I wanted to do, whereas create data, find places, right? So when they do the find places, they don't use a specific data set, right? They do the anonymous data, and then they do geocoding and stuff, so the anonymous connections. I think a lot of developers actually want, well, my guess is a bunch of developers, maybe they know, and a lot are doing this anonymously, but my guess is a bunch come in wanting to access their data set, and they aren't getting access to it. So I think that's my wrap up. Overall, they did a really good job. They need to do a little bit better on targeting some of the primary use cases I think people who are storing data in their site are using and being able to help them get to their data. They do a nice job of doing the quick win to show that you got the API working. They have a well-designed API, which is really nice. I would say the API doc, all that long doc needs to be broken out, and they need to have some more tasks focused stuff that links to the longer docs, right? So which is these are the tasks, right? These overviews. It's just they don't do it with a specific data set, right? So I could pull some of the stuff together. I've dealt with much worse doc. This is actually really good. They don't have any on tables though either. It would be nice to have one on tables as well, since a lot of times we're dealing with spatial and non-spatial data, and I need to get access to the tables. So put one on tables, please. I would say they do need to spend considerably more time though on explaining their query language and putting good doc around it and how it works, and on how they handle time. And especially in the Python SDK, maybe it does it in the other SDKs. It says how it does the conversions. I still have no idea how the Python SDK converts it to my time zone. Like, it's probably grabbing some environment variable, but I don't even know what that is. And it doesn't talk about how to change that. So I have ended up using the Python time libraries. So if I took this code and put it on somebody's machine in the Eastern time zone, I don't know what's going to happen. Right? I've tried to bulletproof my code to say convert whatever time this is to UTC, but we'll see. All right, so that's the wrap up for here. Again, this was my first step at coming up with this series of critiquing developer sites, or talking about developer sites and what they could do better, and what they do great, and some areas where they could improve. So I would love it if people left me comments about what they would like to see. Was this helpful? Was this not helpful? I had a lot of fun doing it. I had a lot of fun learning the API. There's times when I was really frustrated, but so I've got all my code now. It's all running and it does a whole bunch of fun stuff, right? I broke it up into nice tables and learned a lot of Python and learned some good ArcGIS Online stuff. It was just a fun project. So I would love to do this more if people find it helpful. Let's see, the next stream on Friday, we're going to go back to some Postgres stuff, and we're going to talk about Explain Analyze. And Explain Analyze is really about when you're trying to not troubleshoot so much as look at performance issues, or you want to understand how Postgres is handling your SQL and turning that into the query that it does. The next week after that, I'll probably do another one of these live streams, and I'll do the PostgreSQL site from a developer's perspective, like an application developer's perspective, not from a PostgreSQL developer, like working on Postgres, nor from a DBA's perspective, because I can't really live either of those personas, but I do live the developer's perspective, especially I like putting a lot of empathy into the getting started. And the reason why is because, and I have to keep saying this to engineers over and over again, is if I can't get the developer past this suck threshold, they're never going to get to all your cool, exciting features. So that's great that you built all these really cool, complicated features, but if we can't get them up there, she's never going to stick with your thing and never get to your cool feature. So one of your top things, not the only thing, but one of your top things should be making sure this part of the curve is as close to this as possible. So doc, examples, good designed APIs, those are all easy to understand APIs. Even if you need to make like a simple API and then a more complicated API that people can graduate to, all those things are really important for all the really cool stuff you want them to do, right? So anyway, I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I will see you on Friday. Thanks, everyone. Bye.